United States presidents almost always arrive in style, even when they reach the end of the line. This Union Pacific train, pulled by a locomotive painted like Air Force One, is bringing former President George H.W. Bush to his final resting place at his presidential library in College Station, Texas. Although this is the most recent and well-documented presidential funeral train, several other presidents have received this distinct honor. It may be a morbid topic, but trains like these allow the public to pay their last respects and are an interesting part of our nation's history. So join us now as we look back on presidential funeral trains. A 21-gun salute, flyovers, lying in state in Washington, and a state funeral at Washington National Cathedral. You know, there are all kinds of ceremonies and traditions that honor a president when he passes away, but there's something special and memorable about a train journey. Although it wasn't well documented, the first deceased president to be carried by train was William Henry Harrison. He died while in office on April 4, 1841, at the age of 68 from enteric fever. 2 decades later, the nation would be mourning the loss of Abraham Lincoln. He died on April 15, 1865, at the age of 56 after being shot by assassin John Wilkes Booth. A train draped in black cloth was assembled to take him from Washington to his final resting place in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, with several stops along the way. It also transported Lincoln's son, Willie, who had died of typhoid fever in 1862. The train would travel over different railroads and be hauled by various locomotives. Thousands of people came out to the tracks to see the train pass by. Lincoln's coffin would ride in the equivalent of Air Force One today, a private presidential rail car called the United States. However, Lincoln never actually used this car while he was alive. As you can see, the car rode on 4 trucks, and it could be converted to run on either standard or 5-foot gauge track. The original car was ultimately destroyed by a fire after being sold off, but in 2015, a replica was built. It now resides at the Harrisburg, Lincoln, and Lancaster Railroad in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. The next president whose remains traveled by funeral train was James Garfield. He was actually shot while in office at a train station in Washington in July 1881. He was later taken to Long Branch, New Jersey to recover, but ultimately died on September 19, 1881 at age 49. His body was brought to the U.S. Capitol by train and later to Cleveland, Ohio for burial. Now, Civil War General and former President Ulysses S. Grant didn't have a state funeral in Washington. However, he was taken to his final resting place by train. He died of throat cancer on July 23, 1885, at the age of 63 in Wilton, New York. A train took his remains to his alma mater at West Point and later New York City. As the years went on, the documentation of these funeral trains improved. President William McKinley died on September 14, 1901 at age 58 after being shot by an assassin in Buffalo, New York. Trains would be used to take him to Washington and later to his last stop in Canton, Ohio. Some of the cars that hauled deceased presidents were used by these men in life and death. This is the Superb. It was used by Warren G. Harding as his personal Pullman car. Sadly, it also had to be used to transport his body back to Washington from San Francisco after he died of a heart attack on August 2, 1923 at age 57. He was ultimately taken to Marion, Ohio for burial. However, his car, the Superb, lives on. It's preserved at the Southeastern Railway Museum in Duluth, Georgia. And now we'll move on to a legendary president who served longer than any man before him. Franklin D. Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, at the age of 63 was very well documented. He died of an intracerebral hemorrhage at his retreat at the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. This newsreel captured the moment he left Warm Springs. Thousands would come out to witness the train journey from Georgia to Washington. Like other presidential funeral trains, people from all walks of life were able to say one last goodbye. Eventually, the train would back into Union Station and the deceased president was taken through the streets of Washington on a field artillery caisson. President Roosevelt would later be taken to Hyde Park, New York for burial. Now, FDR did travel by air while in office, but like other leaders before him, he made extensive use of rail cars during his political career. And if you want to see one of his personal rail cars, I've got an inside look at the Marco Polo, and the link is in the end screen of this video. More than 2 decades after FDR passed away, the nation would say goodbye to another pivotal leader from World War II. Dwight D. Eisenhower died of congestive heart failure on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78. He passed away at Walter Reed Army Medical Center and had a state funeral in Washington shortly after. The former president had requested that he be dressed in his military uniform from World War II and buried in a casket that was government issue and standard for a soldier in the U.S. Army. No doubt, Ike worked with many world leaders during his lifetime, and some came to the U.S. to pay their respects. Here's French President and former General Charles de Gaulle. Naturally, he's riding in a Citroën. And in a different shot, we see the Shah of Iran. After services in Washington, a train would take Eisenhower to his hometown in Abilene, Kansas. Union Pacific locomotives would ultimately pull the train to its final destination where Ike's casket would be unloaded from a Chesapeake and Ohio baggage car. Eisenhower's funeral and burial was held on the grounds of his presidential library and museum. The country wouldn't see another funeral train until the passing of former President George H.W. Bush on November 30th, 2018, at the age of 94, after a battle with Parkinson's disease. Following a state funeral in Washington, his body was flown back to Texas, where a train took him from Spring to the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College Station. An EMD SD-70 ACE led the train, and number 4141 is painted in a scheme inspired by Air Force One. When it was unveiled in 2005, the former president actually got to run the engine a short distance. The funeral train's journey was televised, and people who gathered trackside were able to see the casket through a window installed on the side of a Union Pacific baggage car. On the rear of the train, a business car with its drumhead displaying the presidential seal. Of course, this is not a conventional passenger train. This equipment typically makes up something called an office car special to haul railroad executives and their guests. And strangely, even though it wears a special paint scheme, number 4141 actually had to be reactivated for this trip after spending several years in storage. Like other presidential funeral trains, people lined the tracks to say goodbye to the former commander-in-chief. The train's final stop would be next to Texas A&M's Kyle Field, where the casket would be unloaded from the baggage recreation car Council Bluffs and transported to the Presidential Library. However, the locomotive, number 4141, would eventually return to College Station. In 2019, Union Pacific donated the unit to the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum, where it now sits alongside a helicopter that once served as Marine One. Okay, so what about former President Jimmy Carter, who died on December 29, 2024, at age 100? Well, a New York Times article said his original funeral plans called for a trip by train. And from what I've been able to gather, the train would have been made up of cars from Norfolk Southern's Office Car Special. However, the New York Times article reported President Carter once said to his staffer, quote, "If you take my cold, dead body across the U.S. by train, I'll haunt you until the day you die." Of course, former President Carter was a great humanitarian and peacemaker, but he also wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Perhaps he just didn't want all that attention. So that's a brief look at the funeral trains that have carried American presidents. Some of these trains were run out of necessity, while others were a distinctive tribute that not every president got. Regardless, this may be the best way for the general public to say goodbye to their leaders. Okay, as I've mentioned in past videos, This channel is getting really close to 100,000 subscribers, so if you could help me reach that milestone, I'd really appreciate it. Anyway, that's it for now. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.